Welcome, everyone. I am Kim Walski, the current president, but outgoing president of the Society for Environmental Population and Conservation Psychology, or Division 34 of the American Psychological Association. And this is our July installment of our webinar series, Improving Our Science, Increasing Our Impact. And it is a special one at that. Today we have with us a panel of speakers, all of whom were involved in the American Psychological Association's Task Force on Climate Change, which you may be aware released a report this past February entitled Addressing the Climate Crisis, an Action Plan for Psychologists. So as part of today's webinar, we're going to learn more about sort of the history and effort that went into this report, and importantly, the call to action to psychology as a field broadly, as well as to APA as an organization. As with prior webinars, you are welcome to put your questions in the Q&A box at any point. Our goal is to open this up to broader discussion about halfway through the hour. And without further ado, let me introduce our moderator, Dr. Susan Clayton. Dr. Clayton, in addition to being a past president of Division 34, is the Whitmore Williams Professor of Psychology at the College of Wooster in Ohio. She has written about the effects of climate change on mental health and was a lead author on that topic for the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. She is a fellow of APA and is currently a member at large on the APA Board of Directors, and it was through that role that she served as a liaison to the task force. So I will turn it over to you, Susan.
Yes, thanks so much, Kim. Thanks for that introduction. And thank you for hosting this webinar, and thank you to all of those who are here today. What I wanted to do, and I will have to acknowledge that unerringly, the lawnmower outside my window has started up, but hopefully it will, if you do hear it, it will be very brief. I want to provide a little background on this task force report. So Kim, if you could put up the next slide. This is a very abbreviated timeline, just to show you that APA has been involved in this question for some time. And certainly there were psychologists thinking about and working on climate change before 2009, and certainly Division 34 was involved in looking at it before 2009. But 2009 was when the first task force on the interface between psychology and global climate change was received by Council. And then that report, which was chaired by Janet Swim, was published in a special issue of American Psychologist. And also the Council of Representatives passed this resolution affirming psychologists' role. So really just saying, yes, this is a psychological issue. For some of you who have been in the field as long as I have may remember how hard it was to convince people of that at one point. Then some years went by emphasizing really research and publications. But in 2019, APA stepped up to the bat to host or co-host an international summit on psychology of global health, which brought together psychological organizations from around the world in Portugal, committing those participating organizations to act on climate change. And the next year, then APA President Sandy Shulman proposed a new task force to address climate change. And the Council of Representatives authorized this task force, and also a new resolution on APA's response to the global climate change crisis. And then just last fall, another edition of the periodic white papers emphasizing mental health and climate change came out. So next slide. So the task force that was established in 2020 was charged with reviewing APA's activity to talk about how psychology had addressed global climate change, and especially recommend goals and strategies for future APA activities. And I think we would probably all agree that this recommending goals and strategies is the most important part. And also, I think this is very important, make recommendations regarding APA's own practices. In other words, we wanted APA or the movers of the resolution wanted APA as an organization to walk the talk and think about what they were doing that might have an impact on the global climate. Next slide, please. So the task force was very deliberately interdisciplinary and international, and here is a list of the full participants. APA staff were definitely full members of the task force as well, and played a key role in moving it forward. And yes, I think there's one more slide. The liaisons, yes, thank you. So I am a liaison. Janet Swim was a liaison. We were both involved with the earlier task force. Nobody from the earlier task force was actually on this task force, which was, I think, important to start from ground zero and not, be already narrowing our windows of what was being looked at. But it was certainly a privilege and I think useful for us to be involved as liaisons, and several of the other earlier members were also consulted. So that said, let me introduce the people who are going to be telling you a little bit more about their participation today. And we didn't actually, I think, did we decide who was going to speak first? Raise your hand if you remember. Nope. Okay. So I am going to start with the order that I happen to have on my slide. Gabrielle Wong-Parodi, who is an interdisciplinary social scientist, theoretically grounded in both psychology and decision science, and has worked on how people make decisions to address the impacts of climate change, and also how robust interventions can empower them to make decisions that will improve their ability to address climate change in their lives, communities, and societies. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Earth System Science and a Senior Fellow at the Wooster Institute for the Environment at Stanford University. And I'll just go ahead and introduce all of the speakers, and then if anybody feels moved to change the order of speaker, they can do so. Ezra Markowitz is another previous president, past president of Division 34, which I think goes to show what an important position that is. He is an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Conservation at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And Scott Barstow is the Director of Congressional Affairs for Advocacy at the American Psychological Association and also American Psychological Association Services, APASI. And Scott has worked on mental health policy issues for more than 2 decades. And if any of you were at the Advocacy Day on Sunday, you heard Scott talk and give some evidence of his expertise on this issue. So again, unless anybody wants to change the speaking order, I'm going to start with Gabrielle.
Sure. So you want me to just talk just a little bit about my background, or
talk about your experience on the task force, maybe what
okay.
why you agreed to be involved, what you hope to accomplish.
Sure. I mean, so for a number of years, I had been working on projects in the Gulf Coast and in other areas where people were repeatedly affected by increasing extremes of related to climate change. So from hurricanes to wildfires to tornadoes. So I became very interested in how people were making decisions and how those decisions were impacting livelihoods and the ability for people to reduce their exposures and to ultimately have improved health over time. And so when this opportunity came up, I think I may have seen an advertisement for it. I applied and I got in contact with Howard, who is involved in leading it up. And I was really interested in understanding how we could bring psychology to bear on the issues around climate change, and how we could think about research and education and communicating about climate change more effectively. So that is how I got involved. And so I can turn it over to the next person. So I think maybe that's Ezra.
That would be great. We'll have everybody introduce or maybe say a little bit about their background, and then we'll come back
Sure.
and have people
Okay.
talk about the recommendations. And let me just, I forgot to remind the audience, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as possible later on. So Ezra, maybe talk about why you got involved.
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to see so many people in attendance. I see we're up over 50, which is great. So, I mean, I know a lot of the people who are here today, which is really nice. I've been working in this field since I was in graduate school about 15 years ago. And I remember that first report coming out right as I was working on, I think, my comprehensive exam on the psychology of climate change, which was really at pretty much perfect timing for me. And so it's an area that I've been working in for a long time. And when this second task force came along, and with a focus really from like the state of the field, which was I think the major focus for the first report 10 years ago, to now what do we do 10 years later? It made a lot of sense, and I was really excited to have been invited to participate and be able to bring my own work on psychology and climate change, the communication, persuasive and effective communication around climate change and environmental issues more broadly to be able to contribute in whatever way I could. So that's how I got involved.
Thanks. And maybe Scott, you could introduce yourself.
Sure. So even though I've been working as a lobbyist on mental health policy for quite a while now, when I was an undergrad, I came dangerously close to changing my degree because I took a fascinating class on environmental ethics. So I've always had somewhat of an interest in environmental policy. At my previous job, I was at another organization for quite a while and decided to go back and get a master's degree in environmental science and policy. And as part of that program, I took a course on communication theory and research because it was so clear that a lot of the political discourse was getting in the way of what happened. So started getting exposed to some of the research on that aspect of things. So I have to say that it's very, very much an honor to be able to be speaking with some of the leaders in the field here on that crucial aspect of this. So having come to APA and known Howard, I heard about the task force report and the work that was going to be going on. And so I asked Howard if I could start sitting in and joining the meetings, and he said yes. So it was great to be part of that. I really appreciated that.
Great, thanks. And so now the panelists will walk us through the recommendations that the task force made, and we'll start with Ezra.
Yeah, so hopefully at least some folks on here have been able to take a look at the report. I think it's my sense is that it's very accessible, and in large part that's due to the incredibly hard work and excellent writing of Howard Kurtzman, who's on the call, I think, with us today. But just, I don't know that, did we give any, I don't think we gave any overview. Just so very quickly, let me give structure, and then I'll go into the research, the two sections that I was going to cover. So we made there's kind of 12 very broad recommendations. And by broad, I mean the things that you're seeing on the page right now. So these are the two very high level recommendations for research. And for each of the 6 areas that you'll hear about: research practice, advocacy, communication, education, and one more. I can't remember the 6th one, but we'll get to all of them. We have these two in practice. We have these, my other one. We have these 2 categories of strengthening the field, a recommendation that kind of is oriented towards strengthening the field, and a recommendation that was oriented towards broadening the impact of psychology and psychologists who are working on climate change. So in the kind of research sector domain, in terms of strengthening the field, we have this very high level recommendation of advancing research on climate change across all areas of psychological science. That is super vague. And in part, that's because there were just so many things that could mean and could look like. So I think what each of us are going to do is just give a couple of more concrete examples from each of these 2 high level recommendations for each of the 6 sectors. So within research, what does that look like for strengthening the field? We came up with things like APA can be kind of helping to determine high priority topics for new psychological research on climate change, which would be a new role. Doing things like advocating for funding of research on the psychology of climate change, both with federal funders, but also more in the private and the foundation world, which also would be, we'll hear more about this, I think, in a moment. APA does lots of advocacy on behalf of getting research funding for psychology, but to really be focused on psych and climate change would be a new thing. There are recommendations, sub-recommendations in terms of things like publications and working with editors at all of the different APA journals to include climate change in the scope of the journal itself, and to try eventually to move towards doing that for all of the journals, which would be a really major, I think, a pretty major shift to see climate change be called out as a topic of focus, regardless of what the domain of the journal is. On the broadening impact side of promoting engagement with of psychological scientists, policymakers, practitioners, community members, and others on climate issues, we had some more specific recommendation, things like sponsoring internships, fellowships, and other sorts of placements of psychological scientists who are working on climate topics within government, nonprofits, think tanks, policy world, advocacy organizations, and also things like putting together convenings of virtual meetings that bring together psychological scientists with other US and international leaders on climate issues, which is something that APA, as we heard just from Susan's history, has started to happen, but to see more of that happening. And then in terms of practice, which I think is the next sector that I was also going to talk about. So here, our strengthening the field, you can see, was to build psychologists' capacity to support people in mitigating and adapting to climate. What does that look like? It's things like establishing and maintaining a repository of information on effective assessments, interventions, services, programs for mitigation adaptation in diverse populations. Putting together user-friendly written and video materials for practitioners and their clients. Obviously, APA is very practitioner-oriented as an organization in terms of its 100,000 plus membership. And so there's a lot of work to be done there. We thought that APA can really be doing to help support those practitioners in bringing climate change and climate concerns into their work. On the broadening impact side of enlarging the range of settings and partnerships in which psychology and practitioners are working on climate change, that looks like working with governments, attorneys, private organizations to make sure that people who have, for example, migrated due to climate change, climate refugees, for example, that they receive appropriate mental and behavioral health care, and that's coordinated with other sorts of health and social services that they might need as a result of being climate migrants. It also means things like building and strengthening international networks of psychologists and other healthcare professionals, social service providers, local governments, businesses, et cetera, to really help them be more efficient and coordinated in the delivery of services to communities who are being impacted now by various types of climate impacts. And now I think we'll move on to education.
Great, thanks, Ezra. I'm going to take education next. And so when we're thinking about strengthening the field, we thought about kind of at a very high level, incorporating climate change into all levels of psychology education. And so what might that look like? So this might be developing curriculum, textbooks, videos, and other teaching materials on climate change and its psychological dimensions that would target all levels of education. So from high school all the way up through graduate and continuing education courses in psychology. In terms of broadening impact, we discussed promoting coverage of the psychological dimensions of climate change in the education of other professionals and the public. And there, when we're thinking about the public, we were thinking about informal educational opportunities, which might be zoos or aquaria and kind of other venues where people might interact with information related to climate change. And so this might involve working with faculty and associations and other fields to design curricula and course materials about the psychological dimensions of climate change, and to use that information in training of other professionals as well. And so here we are thinking about casting a very broad net with respect to working across different disciplines and different professions. So environmental scientists, physicians, nurses, lawyers, journalists, people in clergy, regional planners, forest managers, engineers, architects, etc. Next slide, please. And we also discuss in this report communication. And so here, when we're thinking about strengthening the field, we were thinking that APA could serve as an important channel of information to psychologists about climate change and how psychologists can contribute to effective climate action. And so here we discuss just kind of more concretely supporting and growing a community of psychologists and other professionals who are interested in climate change. And this could be by developing communications around dedicated newsletters, Twitter account on psychology and climate change. These could act as fora for communication across different activities, and it could be an opportunity to share news, job opportunities, information about new findings, etc., to help develop that a cohort of psychologists who are interested in climate change and effective ways to communicate about it, as well as effective ways to communicate within the community. With respect to broadening impact, here we were discussing educating the public about the psychological dimensions of climate change and effective climate action. And here, one concrete example could be to engage with news organizations and social media companies. So Meta using social media outlets like Facebook and Twitter to develop strategies to facilitate dissemination of accurate information about climate change, and in an effort also to limit misinformation. So really leveraging those channels that the public uses often to communicate about climate change. Okay.
Okay, I think I'm up for the last couple here. So advocacy, as some of the people on the call here know and participated in, we just had an advocacy summit on climate change on Sunday and yesterday with meetings with House and Senate members asking for their support for legislation to ensure that there's a national planning and support for state and local planning as well to prepare for the health impacts, including the mental health impacts and health inequity impacts of climate change. APA has been doing work, advocacy work on climate change before Sunday, certainly. One of the first things that I was able to be a part of when I came to APA back in, I think 2013, it might have been 2014, but there was a climate and health symposia over a couple of days that we hosted up on our meeting space on the top floor of the building. The reports with Eco America that Susan highlighted at the beginning. Over the last couple years, we've been stepping up our advocacy even more than previously and are regularly participating in work done by an informal coalition called the Healthy Air Partners Coalition, led by the Lung Association and other groups. And there's meetings each week about regulations that the Environmental Protection Agency is considering, new legislation that might be introduced in Congress. So we're stepping up our engagement, definitely. I should say a couple more things. One is that, as was discussed on Sunday, this is both a sprint and a marathon. Our advocacy office takes a very expansive approach to what that word advocacy means. So we know that there's going to need to be a lot more work, not just at the federal level, but also at the state and local level, and that psychologists and others engage in with their institutions, places where they work, family, friends, etc. So let's go to the next slide. With respect to APA's energy use and sustainability, this is kind of a similar situation in that APA has been taking action in the past, but we're trying to ramp that up now. As some of you may know, APA's headquarters building across the street from Union Station on Capitol Hill in DC is a LEED Platinum building, which we are very proud of and continue to be very proud of. But one thing that is becoming clear as the climate change issue makes it very, very clear that sustainability really needs to mean, first and foremost, doing what's necessary to reduce energy use and the emissions associated with energy use. Research is showing that LEED certification doesn't necessarily have much correlation with energy performance. And also, we're fortunate that one of our tenants in the second building on Capitol Hill that we own, one of our tenants is the World Resources Institute. And the World Resources Institute literally wrote the book along with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development on how to measure greenhouse gas emissions and conduct a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Howard and I have shared information with APA leadership on how we might go about doing that for APA and measuring our scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions, setting an emissions target, and then trying to meet that. So there's a lot of work to be done on both of those last two fronts. I'll stop there.
Great. So let me ask a few questions of the panelists. And then again, please, I hope members of the audience are thinking of questions they might want to raise, or also comments or suggestions they might have. But my first question is, a lot has been happening in the world. That's kind of an understatement over the past 2 years that the task force met. Much of which emphasized the importance of climate change, much of which also took our attention away from climate change. And I wonder if you have thoughts about how those events shaped either the process or the outcome in the sense of what you decided to include in the report. Ezra, how about you?
Yeah, totally. A lot of things have happened in the last couple of years. I think there's no doubt that COVID certainly added to our discussions, and at least this is what I'm remembering. We'll see what Scott and Gabrielle remember as well. And just became a new lens for us to think about the role of psychology in addressing social issues and societal issues, including both expected and unexpected ones that come up. And I think, even beyond the report, many of us who are on this call probably have seen that there's been quite a lot of both empirical research and conceptual work done in the past couple of years, trying to draw some parallels between the psychology of COVID response and the psychology of climate, both looking for similarities and differences between the two. And I think some of that came into the task force report. And also, I suspect, and I'm interested to hear what the other panelists think, that it kind of just the overall stresses that we've had both on individuals and on societies, communities and societies over the past couple of years that we were working on the report helped give kind of additional weight to the work that we were doing, that made it feel like, yeah, we really need to be as concrete as possible and to get past those top level recommendations that are listed in table 1 of the report on page 20 and get into the details. And I think we spent a lot of time kind of hashing out, well, what do these recommendations look like on the ground? What are the actual things that APA and its membership can be doing over the coming years to really try to push things forward in a positive direction? And I suspect that we would have taken that seriously regardless of what was happening in the world, even if all trends had looked positive. But the fact that it was a tough couple of years, I think, at least for me, made it feel like we need to be concrete and to really try to get this report into a place where it could really push APA, at the very least, push APA as a large organization with a big footprint in the world and a big footprint in this domain in a positive direction and in a concrete way that action can really be taken.
Can I jump in here, Susan? Totally echoing what what Ezra said and completely agree. And I think there were events, for example, January 6th that occurred that really highlighted kind of, at least in the United States, where we're at, what the political and social situation is, and how sometimes we feel so divided, and how partisan the issue of climate change and how politicized the issue of climate change has become. And this kind of the use of different ways that we communicate and we are in our communities through social media can result in these echo chambers and the spread of misinformation. So these events and just the psychological research that was going on or that has been going on around kind of trying to understand how information spreads and what gets taken up and what doesn't made it into the report and were the topic of some serious discussions that we had. And then kind of this over time, this kind of retraction from engaging on climate change as a nation to kind of maybe going back to kind of pulling back again, I think highlighted some of the issues around, well, what recommendations can we make at the federal level versus what sorts of recommendations and focus can we make at kind of the local level or the state level. And so the current events that were happening definitely influenced the conversations we were having and ultimately some of the things that we put into the report.
Yeah, I think that comment about needing to consider how the issue can be addressed at multiple levels is really important. Scott, did you want to add anything to this?
Just to reiterate that, yeah, the gridlock and politicization, tough word to say, at the federal level, and as evidenced by January 6th and its aftermath, shows that we can't put all our eggs in the basket of, oh, well, Congress will fix this type thing. So we need to push on all fronts.
Great. Well, we have discovered that Howard Kurtzman is in the audience, and Howard was intimately involved in shepherding this whole task force, as well as the components of the task force, as the lead head of the science director at the APA. He has since left the APA, but he's obviously continued to be engaged with the organization and with the issues. So I want to invite him to comment on anything you want to say about your experience with the task force report or directions for moving forward.
Thanks, Susan. It's great to see everyone, Scott, Ezra, and Gabrielle. Yeah, we worked for about a year and 3 months on the report. And we had a really great task force. Gail Sinatra was a great chair. And I enjoyed working with her. I'll note that the report, although pretty lengthy, a briefer version of it is going to appear, I hope, this year in American Psychologist. We just got the proofs for it, so it should be out pretty soon, at least on an online version. I think that the report has succeeded and met the goals that I had. I was concerned that the leadership of APA they're great people and very smart, but maybe didn't fully understand, with some exceptions, what the climate change and psychology nexus was and what role APA should play. So I was hoping that the report would give a clear outline of that and justification for why APA should be working in this space. And I think that has succeeded based on conversations I've had with the leadership of APA. One point that I've heard over the years is that, oh, well, not that many psychologists are interested in climate change, or not that many members of APA are interested in climate change. I think that was true at one time. I think that's changing. The attendance at this Advocacy Summit over a weekend, this past weekend, was amazing. There was another webinar a couple months ago, Susan, that you were in on mental health and climate change that was extremely well attended, compared to other webinars that we have. And obviously the world around us is showing that climate change is real and people are beginning to see it affecting their lives and people around them. So I think we're in a transition period now where psychology and psychologists really are interested in climate change and want to do something. And this report helps provide guidance on how to do it. The report is framed as recommendations for APA as an organization, but they apply largely to the entire psychological community. People can do a lot of these activities without going through APA. And I think we want to get that point across going forward. So I feel like we've made some real progress. Again, I want to say it was wonderful to work with my colleagues, those on this call and others on the panel. And I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes next. Thanks.
Thanks, Howard. I agree with what you say about not being sure how solid the commitment or the understanding maybe was of some of APA governments about the issue. And so I was delighted to see at Sunday's summit, I'm pretty sure that the current APA president, the president-elect, and the past president were all among those attending that advocacy day. So I think, I think there's been a real recognition that psychology not only has to be at the table, but is at the table when it comes to this issue. Kind of building on what you just said, I wanted to give the panelists a chance to comment on what you might have learned from being on this task force, or how your perspective might have changed, or just any of your observations about the process of putting together the task force report. Anyone?
The first thing that comes to mind for me, it may sound kind of odd, but it was fun. It was just very enjoyable at a deep level to be talking with other very knowledgeable, passionate, concerned people about this, arguably the major problem facing humanity today. Just having those conversations on a regular basis, comparing notes, knowledge, was satisfying. And I mean, so it's my primary takeaway, I guess.
I think that's a great reminder. What we often tell people about one of the best ways to cope with your anxiety about climate change is to get involved in collective action, because not only will you be more effective, it's just a positive experience to be engaging with other people around this issue. Anyone else want to comment about their experience or their shifts in perspective?
I'll say something. I think what the task force succeeded in doing was bringing together in a meaningful way a very rigorous scientific approach with concerns about climate justice and what's called an APA public interest issues. And even other non-scientific approaches. We had several discussions about indigenous approaches and how to integrate them with Western scientific approaches. And I think a lot of us, certainly I, gained a lot from that and have a broader perspective, and that it is possible at an organization like APA or in the field of psychology to integrate these different concerns in meaningful ways, not just superficial ways.
Yeah, and I'd build on that. I think for me, one of the most enjoyable parts of being on the task force was how diverse the membership was. We had a lot of disciplinary perspectives on there. It was not just psychologists, and it wasn't just kind of the usual characters of people working in the field of psych and climate change. And that meant that there was tension sometimes, which is, I think, a good sign of a group that is trying to be productive and push and not just be comfortable. And, we had, I don't remember exactly how many people, but, a dozen or so folks plus all the other contributors like Susan and Janet and, the liaisons and the staff. And many, many more ideas and, I think ideas of what should be included, what recommendations were the most important ones than we could actually put in there. And I think one of the toughest jobs probably for Howard and Gail as the leaders was to keep reining us in. They did a masterful job of letting us go big and then really figure out, okay, now how do we get down to something that's manageable, reminding us this is like a little microcosm of what I think we're all going to have to do in the climate space, not just climate and psych, which is to prioritize and make trade-offs, really tough trade-offs about where to allocate limited resources, not just financial or monetary resources, but our time and energy and attention. And we had to do that as a group, and we will have to do that as an organization within APA, and we'll have to do that within our own communities and as society, writ large, as we try to figure out what to do in what order, or how to get as much done as possible, recognizing that some things have to happen sequentially and other things can happen in parallel. And that's just as true of APA trying to take on climate change as it is of society taking on climate change. And we had to do that as a group, and we did it because we had good leadership. And it was a good reminder of how critical it is to have people who have, I don't think Howard and Gail as the leaders, they didn't know what the final 12 recommendations were going to be unless Howard kind of had his evil plan hatched 2 years ago. But they did have a vision of how to get us there, I think, or at least they figured out how to get us there in a way that let us explore and get through the tension and figure out what we had enough consensus around to include, and then to actually get a report out the door. And hopefully we will have something similar happening within APA as it's trying to take on climate change moving forward.
This leads me to a question that I hadn't planned to ask, but came up in my mind. This task force, I'm pretty sure, had all its meetings remotely, right? The previous task force on climate change had all its meetings remotely, but a lot of task force don't. Now, clearly there's been more movement in that direction because of the pandemic, but there's still a lot of concern about what we might lose moving to virtual meetings, though clearly we also gain a lot in terms of reduced environmental impact. And I wondered if any of you had any thoughts about the effectiveness of the virtual interactions. Did you lose something? Did you gain something? What implications might this have for APA practice moving forward?
I mean, I'm not sure what for the previous task force, how often they met. But I felt like with meeting remotely, we were more nimble. We could meet when we needed to. And I think we met fairly often, and it was a more flexible platform for us. We were also able to kind of break off into small groups and have kind of easily, when we were all just kind of breaking off and, okay, you're focusing on research, you're focusing on communication, there's a team lead for that, to have those types of meetings quickly. And I enjoyed that. And I think that the platform seemed to work pretty well. And I think all of us were also dealing with creating new course curriculum and kind of figuring Zoom out as we went along. And I think that this is also just going to be part of a general trend in workplace, regardless of moving meetings remotely. And so it seemed like this worked pretty well. Although it would be nice, I think, once in a while to meet in person, kind of those informal, off the cuff conversations weren't always happening. So I don't know what other people thought.
I mean, Howard could speak to this better than me because he put in far more hours on this than I did. But just as a relatively less involved than Howard was as a person staffing it, I have a hard time imagining we could have gotten done what we got done in 1 or 2 2-day long or 3-day long meetings, as opposed to, having a 2-hour meeting one week, letting people think about it, work on it, digest it, and then come back a week or two later and approach it that way. So I totally agree with what Gabrielle said.
And I agree with what both of you have said. And I would add that the real one of the major benefits of meeting by Zoom is that we could make it an international group. We had somebody from Europe and somebody from New Zealand, and scheduling was kind of hard, but at least we were all together. And it would have been difficult to bring everybody, find dates and bring everybody together in person for these meetings.
I think the only drawback that I would have noticed, Susan, relative to other groups, including classes where I've taught where it was online from day one versus meeting and then being online, is that I think it took us a solid 3 or 4 meetings as a group to figure out where we were headed. If I recall correctly, the first couple months, I think, took us some time. And I wonder if that had been, if we'd had an in-person meeting for a day or two, we would have been kind of better grounded to then be able to launch from there and have the rest of the meetings kind of proceed online. But we got there. I think it maybe just took us a little bit longer because we didn't have 8 hours or 16 hours together at the very beginning of the process.
Great. So I want to make sure to address some of the questions we have from the audience. And the first one has to do with misinformation and how, I mean, psychologists are pretty good at understanding information and communication and risk perception. What can be done by psychologists to fight back against these sort of calculated misinformation campaigns that we're seeing, not only about climate change, but definitely about climate change? Gabrielle, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this is not my area of expertise. I don't know if anyone else knows this area better than I do, but this is something that we did discuss for the report, and there is a lot of research on this and some assessments of ways, for example, that social media outlets can flag when information hasn't yet been, is not verified, or maybe misinformation, to see if that makes consumers of that information a little more critical when they're viewing it. And when we're communicating with individuals, just providing accurate evidence-based information using outlets that they trust and that people use, and providing people information through channels that they look to. And so using influential people in social networks and things like that. But I suppose it also depends on what we're communicating to. So there are communicating about, so are we talking about climate change in general, or are we talking about ways to mitigate climate change or ways to adapt? And so the words that we choose can help to reduce defenses when people are getting information. So maybe we don't talk about climate change, but we talk about biodiversity or other things that people may care about and ways we can address those issues. I don't know if other people have thoughts about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, James, I like how you ended your question with using your best cognitive reframing approaches to try and remain hopeful on this big, challenging issue that I actually think has gotten a lot more coverage even just the past couple of years. And I wonder if that's coincided with just the vast amounts of dis and misinformation around COVID, that it's just like climate has become something that psychologists, as you know, as Howard and Susan have noted over the past 10 years, it's something that everybody's paying attention to in a way that they weren't before. Similarly, I think that's with mis and disinformation. And we do have a lot of research, including by folks who are very much within our field, within our own division, who've been working on climate change, mis and disinformation, but also in the domains of COVID and kind of more broadly, that we do know a lot about how to push back, and that there are places, there's a role for APA to put into their practice training, right, with all of their 100,000 plus members, how to get some of those tools out to the millions of clients that APA members work with on a daily or weekly basis. I don't think that this is all going to come down to, personally, that this is APA and Division 34 are going to solve the mis and disinformation campaign challenges that we face in the climate domain. But certainly that we have a role to play, and I hope that some of that came through in the report, in trying to get some of those best practices around communicating or kind of pushing back or combating disinformation campaigns into the hands of people who are actually communicating. And I think it goes beyond just disinformation. That we know a lot around the effective communication of climate change from the work that's been done by our members over the past decade or two, not just on disinformation, but on things like the visual communication of climate change, is a topic where we continue to see, right? You can go look at the headlines from the past couple of weeks of heat waves in Europe and in the US, and we continue to see really misleading visual images used alongside, the heat waves kill hundreds, but then the picture is like lots of people at the beach having a fun time, right? And we know from the work that's been done by members in our division and in our field that there are better ways to communicate both visually and verbally, and we have to continue to keep pushing. And I think it's similar for the disinformation issues that we face in this field.
So there's one question I really want to make sure we get to. And the question is, how will the task force continue to influence APA and psychological practice? And I'll just say the task force is dissolved. So hopefully as individuals, they'll continue to work, but the task force itself doesn't have responsibility. But I hope that APA, which is constituted by its members, that APA members will continue to work, and APA staff, I'm sure will continue to work on this. But the question of how is very much one that I would like to see addressed. So what thoughts do you guys have? And I'm going to pick on you, Scott, first, as the one who is right there in central office.
Well, I am right there in the central office, but I'm not at the top of the pyramid by any stretch of the imagination. So to me, this kind of gets back to the advocacy topic. What do you want to see APA do? I mean, we could, if people ask for it loudly enough to the right people in the right way, APA could start doing the kind of stuff that you're seeing from climate outreach in the UK, for example, and really coming up with a robust suite of tools, recommendations, et cetera, best practices for visual communication, for communicating with psychologist clients, patients, I should say. But the report's relatively fresh, and it did an excellent job of describing the waterfront of what we should consider doing. But what that looks like, where the rubber meets the road, and how we prioritize that hasn't been decided yet. Not that I'm aware of.
Could I add something? I would suggest that Division 34 folks get involved in APA more broadly, get involved with the various boards and committees, run for council, run for the board of directors when Susan's term ends, and that way have some influence on the leadership of APA. It's a political organization. They're dealing with many priorities and constituencies, and yeah, you just have to speak up in a persistent way. Run for president, Susan, maybe.
And as a more concrete, immediate example of that, the Public Interest Caucus meeting, there are several caucus meetings this Friday. And I glanced at the agenda for the Public Interest Caucus meeting, and I didn't see climate change mentioned on there anywhere. Sure. It was a little bit disappointing. Not that they don't have plenty to deal with besides climate change, but.
I would just add to that question, because the task force is disbanded at this point, and I think that's kind of how things run with task force at APA. It is incumbent on other organizations or sub-organizations within APA to kind of keep pushing things forward. So just to reiterate, not just Division 34, but if we have folks from other divisions And the divisions, my sense after many years of working within and adjacent to APA is that the divisions get listened to, especially when they can band together and kind of bring their concerns and kind of keep them going and get them to leadership. So the more diverse of a coalition that can be put together around climate and psychology across divisions and subgroups within APA, the more likely it is to continue to get traction with leadership. And maybe that means Division 34 needs to help lead those efforts. And I know that we started to try to do a little bit of that under my presidency a couple of years ago. And it is a big organization. It has many priorities, as was just mentioned, but I think if there are a coalition of groups that are interested in pushing this to the top of the list, that's a way to keep this going.
Yeah, APA is a big organization, which can make it unwieldy, but can also make it influential. And it is a membership organization. So I think what several of you have said about responding to members' interests and initiatives is very important. And just like any government, even when there's a lot of members, there aren't that many who are actually actively involved. So when you become actively involved, you can make a big difference. So I encourage everyone who's listening to do so, but also to pressure your council representatives to keep pressuring APA to be doing these periodic report cards, report on their sustainability practices, report on their goals for moving towards zero carbon emissions, and keep doing research, keep publishing on this topic, keep raising the question, keep going to conferences, whatever activities fit your professional persona. I think one of the messages of this task force is there are so many different ways that we can professionally engage with this issue, that we can each find a way to do so. Any closing questions from the audience or closing comments from the panelists?
I see we have lots of questions, Susan. I wonder if there's a way, Kim, that we can, whether it's us or other members from Division 34 from the task force, can try to get back to folks, or we can post some sort of responses since we're out of time for today. But I see a whole bunch of questions just came in the last few minutes, all of which would be great for us to be able to respond to eventually.
Sure. We can find a way, if you want to respond to them, to get answers back to those folks.
Yes, so I think we are out of time. We will try to get back to you. And those of you who ask questions, thanks for your attention. And please, I encourage you all to get involved, and maybe you can be part of the next task force in another 5 years or so.
And I just want to pipe in and thank all of you and our surprise panelist, Howard, for joining as well. And just to the audience, I really encourage you to read the report. As someone who teaches in this area, I still found that I gained a lot from reading the report. It's remarkably well written and clear and organized in a way that makes you realize there are all kinds of ways that psychology relates to climate change beyond what you may typically think of. So highly recommend it. And thank you again for the time of all of our speakers today.